Welcome to Mystara for a grown-up subject, the status of slavery across the planet. As Mystara is based on multiple real-world nations, it's going to have real-world problems. But not all slaves are treated equally from nation to nation. Alphatia is happy to work their slaves to death, toiling in mines, while Thyatis slaves have their rights as humans codified in their vast codex of laws. Other nations keep prisoners of war as slaves. Then there's the curious case of the traditional form of slavery in the turtle clan of Etrugan. For those nations that don't practice slavery, the organizations known as the Iron Ring and the von Kessler Merchant House are more than happy to provide a supply to those that deal in flesh. It's a mature subject for certain, but you're a mature audience, so keep listening, you'll learn something. I'm Mr. Welch, and it's time to catch the Underground Railroad. Slavery is not practiced in every nation, obviously. Stephen Karamikos, when taking up the leadership of the nation that bared his name, famously banned it within his borders, which was highly controversial considering how ingrained slavery is in Thyatis. The Shires also do not practice slavery, considering how many times they've been conquered. The thought of owning another sentient creature gets their hackles up. They're tiny, cute little hackles. Irendi is in the same vein. Being used as a prison colony for so long, it makes them despise the thought of forced labor. It also helps that they have one of the most developed penal systems in the known world. Yalarum has a similar history to Irendi and the Shires, being divided between Thyatis and Alphatia for years. When Al-Khalim pushed out the occupiers, he forbade the act of slavery. Minrithad and Glantry, despite their reputations for inhumane cruelty to criminals, don't use slavery. Minrithad doesn't find the practice profitable, and anything that costs the guild's money is illegal. Glantry's use of conjured and created laborers makes the use of slaves moot. Why use slaves to till a field when you can just rent a golem to do it in half the time and you don't have to feed or shelter it? Darokin does use indentured servitude as a punishment for criminals. Since Darokin prefers to fine criminals, anyone who is incapable of paying the fine becomes an indentured servant. Open selling of slaves is highly illegal in the Republic, but minor criminals are used as physical labor to maintain the roads and get other public works created. The indentured policy is complex, as it's not true slavery because the convict earns a wage, though at far below market prices. The servant is provided with room and board by law and is expected to use his wages to repay the fine. Once the fine is paid, the servant is freed immediately. Since the servants are expected to serve the people they wronged, if a person doesn't want the guy who robbed them around, instead the servant becomes a ward of the state. The government then sells the services of the convict to a brokerage who finds the servant a position at a company. The brokerage pays for the room and board, and the company pays the brokerage a specific amount to be divided between the brokerage and the servant. It's heavily regulated, and Darokin does have agencies that regularly check up on the status of indentured servants. Ethengar and the nations of the northern reaches both use prisoners and captives as slavery, something that doesn't endear them to their neighbors. Ethengar's culture frowns on farming work as beneath them, so for this they use captured members of rival clans, or when necessary will raid into rival nations like Glantry or the Helden Freeholds. The slaves are expected to be fit enough to farm land. There's no honor or glory to be earned for taking the very young or infirm. In fact, Ethengar actually has laws prohibiting child labor, slave or free. Moglai Khan has forbidden the taking of slaves from Darokin or Rockholm as their vital trading partners. Slaves are kept until freed by the tribe's Khan, usually when a ransom is paid or the slave is no longer useful. A foreign slave is then unceremoniously put with a caravan and expelled from Ethengar. The northern reaches have a long history of slavery with their system of thralls. Thralls were created in one of two ways, as a punishment for a crime or being taken in a raid. Raiders would target specific people to be taken as thralls, either craftsmen or attractive women. Thralls are given basic room and board, but provided few rights outside of a price to be paid to their owner if they are unjustly killed. Vestland is moving away from this system of slavery, prohibiting foreigners from being enslaved in acts of war. That doesn't stop raiders from their neighbors being turned into thralls if captured, but Vestland is modernizing its laws to make their goods more palatable abroad. Thralls can be freed at any time, either through an agreed-upon price or on the whim of the Jarl. Slaves freed this way do not become full citizens, but instead are freed from working for their original master and given some rights under the law. The dwarves of Rockholm have a strange system of punishment that is practically anti-slavery. Instead of being forced to work, the dwarves are punished by being prohibited from working. They cannot create, manufacture, or work in any meaningful way. The dwarven criminal is forced into a period of inactivity, which for the workaholic dwarves is pure torture. After their sentence is finished, the dwarf is allowed to resume work once more. It's a strange system to outsiders, but the punishment is so severe that dwarves don't even like talking about it out loud. Alfheim does not practice slavery currently, but it did enslave captured orcs for several decades after a failed raid into the nation when the orcs appeared through a bad magic spot's portal. The elves didn't know what to do with the orcs at first. Some wanted them slain outright, But in the end, they kept them to work on maintenance projects and general make-busy work. After years of watching the orcs work for them, the elves developed a pang of conscience and decided to free their prisoners. Many of the orcs returned to the nearby orc tribes in the Darokin foothills, but some decided to stay in Alfheim and live a better life. They're second-class citizens there, but they stayed of their own volition. The elves have actually grown used to the orcs and their attempts to blend in and have become somewhat protective of them. The clans of Etrugan have used slavery for centuries, typically through the use of those punished for breaking one of their laws. The Tiger clan in particular raids its neighbors for slaves on a regular basis, using the slaves as either sacrifices or to die in their mines. Needless to say, Tiger clan slaves have no rights at all, and a bleak future on top of that. For the other clans, slaves are usually used to perform manual labor or to work for the good of the clan. Of special note is the Turtle clan, who by tradition enslaved orphans who had no living relatives. It wasn't out of cruelty, as the children were well cared for, but they were restricted by law from marrying or even becoming a full member of the tribe. As the Turtle clan began to abandon the old ways and their outdated laws, this tradition is quietly being abandoned. Now, orphan children are secretly being sent to other lands to be adopted. While this is against the laws of the clan, no one has ever been accused of freeing the orphans, especially since the leaders of the clan are often the ones arranging for the adoption of the orphans by the clan's allies. Then we come to the slaving capital of the world, Thyatis. Slavery isn't a practice in Thyatis, it's an industry. Slaves work the fields, mine the ores, fight in the arenas, raise the children, and clean the houses. The buying and selling of slaves are a major part of the Thyatian economy. Slaves come from convicted criminals, prisoners of war, and people can even sell themselves into slavery to pay lingering debts. Despite, or because of the rampant nature of slavery, slaves in Thyatis actually have a large number of codified rights. Slavery is not permanent in Thyatis except for criminals sentenced to die in the arenas or the mines. After a certain period, a slave's debt is considered paid and the slave is freed. A slave that worked well and dutifully during their enslavement can actually find themselves in demand once freed. Slaves cannot be mistreated, they must be fed and sheltered. A master who cannot take care of his slaves will be relieved of them. Slaves cannot be forced to fight as gladiators without their consent. House slaves treat their positions as jobs they can't quit, but at least they aren't being tied to for the rest of their lives. Contrary to Thyatis, Alphatia has a massive number of slaves, but isolates them from most of the citizenry and instead uses them for plantation and other similar forms of slavery. Alphatians value their personal freedoms, and while they recognize that slavery is vital to the interests of the empire, they also don't want to see slaves in their daily lives. So as long as the slaves are kept out of sight, the typical citizen pretends they don't exist. Slaves in Alphatia are restricted to non-magic using individuals. Ones that can cast spells are considered too dangerous to live. So the wheat fields of Belissaria are tended to by thousands of slaves. On the continent of Scothar, the Alphatian garrison has pressed the captured Genite people into working the mines at such a reckless pace, they're running out of slaves. While the practice would horrify the Empress if they knew what the cost in lives was, the mineral wealth the slaves are producing is more than enough to keep any curious eyes from looking too much into the practice. While most slavery is state-sanctioned, those nations tend to have laws regarding how slaves can be treated and who can be enslaved. The legions of Darokin are not raiding the shires for forced labor. Thyatis has lawyers that specialize in slavery laws. Karamikos takes a dim view on owning other people. And the shires will feed you to their pigs if you try to enslave them. So if you want to run a hidden gold mine free from the eyes of tax collectors and you need people to work the mine cheap, who do you turn to? Enter the Iron Ring. The slavers that call themselves the Iron Ring are some of the biggest big bads in all of Mystara. They are cruel, malicious, and without redeeming qualities. They will make slaves of anyone without question. They raid homesteads, kidnap travelers, and buy captives from pirates and worse. They sell slaves to bandits, humanoid warlords, and aren't above selling captives to people wanting slaves for a more carnal nature. They repopulate their numbers by torturing slaves until they break and then condition them into mindless soldiers. Because of their loathsome behavior, the Iron Ring has to work in secret or in isolation. The lifespan of an Iron Ring slaver captured by authorities is quite abrupt. Few make it to trial, instead dying in an attempted escape. These attempts almost always end up with the slaver running right into a crowd of people wanting vengeance for a lost relative that were just coincidentally gathered just outside the jail. Conversely, the von Kessler Trading Company is a slaving operation that works above board. Based in Thyatis, the von Kesslers are a ruthless organization devoted to the buying and selling of slaves. They are one of the largest servant brokerages in Darokin and have dealings in Ethengar, Ostland, and Soderfjord to produce slaves there. While the von Kesslers openly are a law-abiding company, their biggest goal is the expansion of slavery into new markets. Karamikos banning slaves was a major blow to their operations in the area. so they have secretly begun supporting Baron von Hendrix to reopen the slave markets. Their primary goal now is to open up Darokin to foreign markets in terms of their indentured servants, either allowing von Kessler to use foreign slaves in Darokin, or using the indentured servants in other countries. It has been met with hostility in Darokin's parliament, but the von Kesslers are patient. The fact that the company openly funds adventurers and mercenaries to track down Iron Ring operations does win them allies in their legislative efforts. While they're slavers, they are trying to appear as responsible slavers. The one group openly opposed to both the von Kesslers and the Iron Ring is a small Thyatis knightly order known as the Daughters of the Gladius. Militant abolitionists, they try to expose the shadier dealings of the von Kesslers as well as openly fight the Iron Ring. Their main problem is they're too few in number to make much of an impact. The von Kesslers barely even know of their existence. They've got numerous allies abroad, but right now their efforts are barely getting started. This concludes another riveting episode of Mystara lore, one that has lingered into the background of the setting but needed to be discussed. More nations than not use some form of slavery, but all have their own version of it. Slavery in-game serves as all sorts of adventure hooks. The Iron Ring makes for great bad guys and even better punching bags. A slave revolt is always a great way to start off an adventure in Alphatia. Exposing the von Kessler's machinations would work as an espionage adventure. Or do what I did and have von Hendrix's daughter feeding the players all sorts of information on the Iron Ring, and only for them to realize that while they were removing the Iron Ring, the von Kesslers were stepping in to replace them. Next week I'm going back to the filling in of the ancient history with Mystara's Age of Abomination, back when various evils ruled swaths of the land before the rise of ancient Thonia, with horrors like the Kopru, Ostigo, and the Beastmen. But until next week, remember, I am Spartacus.